He is also published, thanks, Sydney. He's also published over 350 scientific articles and chapters and edited several textbooks. He serves as a peer reviewer for 30 national and international scientific journals, and he's been married for 45 years. He has 4 children, 6 grandchildren, all of whom are cuter than yours, and he plays the cello and the bluegrass banjo. He makes custom furniture, and also in his free time, fly fishes. So Dr. Clark, we are excited to have you. Please take the stage.
Okay. Thank you, Amber. We're going to speak today about the title of this talk is Doing Something About the Cesarean Rate. And we've got to tell you right up front that this is not going to be exactly the talk that you might expect to a group of individuals who are trying to reduce the cesarean section rate. Because while there are some positive things here, it's not going to be completely positive and completely encouraging, but I do think it'll be realistic. And so let's proceed and talk about doing something about the cesarean rate. Much of what I'm going to discuss today is in this particular paper, and I'll reference 2 or 3 other recently published papers that you might go to as well for further information. I think it's axiomatic in the United States that the cesarean delivery rate is too high. It almost has become a credo, an article of faith that all obstetrical providers have to pledge themselves to. In fact, here's a recent photograph I took. I think these are a group of young individuals who just passed their boards, and as the final step toward becoming an obstetrician gynecologist, you see they're all pledging their allegiance to the concept that the cesarean section rate is too high. Now, there are a number of reasons that are often given for the cesarean rate: ignorance, sloth, greed, failure to practice evidence-based medicine, lack of the appreciation for the wonders of natural childbirth, misogyny, or some other moral failing of you and me who actually practice obstetrics. As you're aware, decades of editorials and expert committees have sought to address this issue. And I'm always reminded that way back in the Cretaceous period, when I was a fellow, I was invited to join a group of individuals and put together on a panel, and this was later published, about how to decrease the cesarean rate. And I remember this because these were people that whose opinions I worshipped and continue to worship: Roger Freeman, Tom Garidi, some of these individuals. And so I was very honored to be on that panel with them. And as we discussed these issues, we all had the answer. Now, we're back now in the 1980s. We all had the answer for how to reduce the cesarean rate. If only doctors would do X, Y, or Z, we're never going to have a problem. And this was a time when the cesarean rate was about 11 to 15%. And as you're aware, I think you're all aware of just how well those suggestions have actually worked. And it reminds me of this passage from the book of Ecclesiastes: what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. And we continue to see the committees and the opinions and the strident opinions published in various papers about how we've got to do something about the cesarean rate. And the solutions which are given are pretty much the same solutions as we came up with decades ago. And of course, the numbers speak for themselves. This is not a completely up-to-date slide. It ends in 2011, but that's for a good reason. And that's because, as you can see, the overall cesarean rate, which rose dramatically over the years, actually began to plateau about 10 years ago. And the most recent CDC data suggested that nationally the cesarean rate is about 33%, really pretty much right where it was 10 or 12 years ago. So we've sort of reached a plateau. Now, these other two curves, one of them represents the primary cesarean rate. One of them represents the VBAC rate, which they've stopped keeping records on about this time. But if you look carefully at the available data, it looks like the VBAC rate has actually increased a little bit since that time. The primary cesarean rate, though, has also increased since that time. So it leaves us plateaued at about 33%. And of course, there's great variation state by state. And if we look at this over time, this was back 2010 to 2015. We can see that California has actually decreased their cesarean rate over that time, whereas states like Mississippi have actually increased their rate over that time. Ultimately, though, we're stuck at about 33% for the United States without any terrific variation from that. So we've got to ask ourselves, why have all these efforts by well-meaning, skilled, intelligent people, why have these all failed? Why are we stuck at 33%? And the answer does not lie in any of those moral failings that we mentioned before. The answer lies in the price of apples. Okay. Now, everybody knows that apples are good. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. You can't ask for a better recommendation than that. And so we might say that the price of apples should be lower because the price of apples doesn't reflect their true value. But we'd only say that if we understood absolutely nothing about economics. And we would understand that the fundamental forces that drive the price of apples have nothing to do with whether apples are good or bad, whether they should be priced higher or lower. Rather, with respect to apples, the price of apples represents an equilibrium between the supply and the demand. It's just that simple, nothing to do with what the price of apples ought to be. And so it is also with the cesarean rate. The cesarean rate in this country is 33% because this is the rate which best meets the demands of the fundamental forces which drive the cesarean section rate. What are those fundamental forces? Well, first of all, public expectations, expectations of perfection, as well as what has been widely described as a culture of blame. What this means is that most parents believe that every child should be delivered in the same condition as when labor began, unless somebody does something wrong. And of course, this assumption ignores sudden catastrophic events. It ignores a wide variation in fetal tolerance of even normal labor, and we'll address this in a minute. It ignores the limitations of current technology. And then the public assumption of blame, that is, more and more people these days believe that all adverse life events must be somebody else's fault. But of course, the risk of intrapartum injury immediately ends when the intrapartum period ends, right? That ends when labor ends. And so cesarean delivery is a ready answer to these public expectations. Number two, the medical legal considerations and the current tort system is another fundamental force that drives the cesarean rate. Allegations of labor mismanagement, intrapartum fetal injury continue to dominate obstetric-related lawsuits. And those of you who have been involved in this sort of thing understand what a flawed system it really is. We have complex scientific issues are ultimately decided by laypersons who are presented with very select facts. Even issues that to a group of real obstetricians would be decided 999 to one way or the other, are presented to a jury as 50-50. That is, you've got one expert saying this, one expert saying that, and there's simply no way to demonstrate to a jury in a case like this that, hey, if we picked 1,000 obstetricians, they would all say this care is just fine. As best they know, this is one person's opinion this way and one person's opinion that way. And unfortunately, none of these things are going to change. Okay, this is pretty much fixed given the power of the plaintiff lobby in the United States today. Some of the I refer you now to this paper. This is a paper that I published in the either the gray or the green, no, the green journal I see here last year, which will give some additional background into this problem with the tort system. And we conclude that myth has replaced reality, yet we are realistically prevented by the current legal system from getting off the train. That is the train of sectioning babies based on weird fetal heart rate tracings, even if our own anecdotal biases could be overcome. I'll mention that following the ACOG standards offers limited protection from lawsuits. For one thing, the standards regarding monitor interpretation are so vague as to be virtually useless, except in the case of a Category 3 tracing, which everybody knows what to do about anyway. However, achieving a good outcome offers complete protection. And once again, cesarean delivery is a ready answer. Yes, we can look at a tracing that has some strange features on it. We can identify the fact that the variability is good. Therefore, the fetus cannot have a significant metabolic acidemia. And we can argue this all we want, or we can just do a cesarean section and problem solved. So rightly or wrongly, cesarean delivery provides a ready answer to this legal system, which is one of the other fundamental forces driving the cesarean rate. Third, the limits of technology. When any of us is managing a labor, there really are two fundamental questions that we have to ask ourselves. Number one, will this baby negotiate the pelvis and deliver vaginally, progress of labor? And number two, will the baby tolerate this process? Now, if we can accurately answer both of these questions, then we will have achieved this perfect cesarean delivery rate. Until we can accurately answer each of these fundamental questions, then by definition, the cesarean rate will never be perfect. It's always going to be generally more, but potentially even less than it ought to be. In terms of technology, electronic monitoring, there's really been no change in 40 years. And for those of you who are much younger than I am, which is probably most of you, I've got some very bad news. The methods of interpreting a fetal monitor that I learned as an intern back in 1979 are exactly the same as they are today. Absolutely nothing has changed. So that covers about 40 years of my professional life. And in terms of monitoring uterine contractions, it's even worse. There's been no change in 50 years. We still use the Montevideo units, which were described well back in the 1960s, and Montevideo units are somehow remain the gold standard for monitoring uterine contractions. There's something fundamentally wrong here. We are still using highly primitive technology. Today, we can tell a woman her risk of trisomy to within 2 decimal places, but we can't tell the likelihood of safe vaginal birth to even within an order of magnitude. And I think that's just it's a crying shame that we seem content with this antiquated technology and with the original, often now proven to be incorrect assumptions that went along with the initial development and introduction of this antiquated technology. Remember that the data is pretty clear that even the worst, most ominous fetal heart rate patterns really only have a positive predictive value for fetal acidemia of less than 20%. What that means is that using fetal monitoring guarantees that more than 80% of our cesareans are retrospectively going to be unnecessary. And that assumes that our threshold for acidemia, which typically we say 7.2, that assumes that's meaningful. Unfortunately, that's not. Remember that there's very good data that links certain fetal heart rate patterns with certain pH values. And the association of certain patterns with certain pH values is not great, but it has marginal accuracy and marginal reproducibility. That part of the puzzle is probably useful. But then we assume that these pH values are meaningful in terms of predicting long-term neurologic outcome. In other words, when we use fetal monitoring, we are relying on good data linking the patterns with the pH, and then an assumption that the pH is meaningful in terms of predicting long-term neurologic outcome. But I think you can see that if this second assumption regarding the relationship between pH and outcome, if that's incorrect, then no matter how well we interpret a monitor strip, how accurately we can predict the pH, that the pH is greater than 7.2, which is what monitoring was designed to predict, that will be completely irrelevant if that 7.2 has very little meaning. And unfortunately, it does have very little meaning. I refer you to this paper. My fellow, Grace Johnson, was the lead author on this, again, in the Green Journal 2 years ago, where we looked at the relationship between cord gases and immediate newborn outcomes and found that there is virtually no relationship between cord gases. And this was in a series of, I think, maybe 40,000 patients. This is a huge series. We found there was virtually no relationship between cord gas and even immediate newborn outcome. Therefore, obviously, there is not going to be a relationship between cord gas and long-term newborn outcome. And yet our entire use of fetal monitoring assumes that that this relationship does exist. Unfortunately, if you'll read this paper, you'll become even more discouraged, because that basically means that no matter how well we read a monitor strip and are able to predict acidemia, we're not going to improve long-term neurologic outcomes by doing a cesarean on that basis. So in terms of these two critical questions, will the baby negotiate the pelvis? Will the baby tolerate the process? Cesarean delivery is the ready answer. We can't figure out if it's going to negotiate the pelvis. Monitoring is not that great, but when you do a cesarean, we're done with the problem. And so that is another fundamental force driving the cesarean rate today. And finally, the fact that the cesarean delivery is incredibly safe. Now, it's true that there is a 10 times higher rate of death among women having a cesarean than among those delivering vaginally, but a deeper examination, and I refer you to the article we published about 15 years ago now, where we did a deep dive into all of those deaths in well over 1 million patients. What we found is that most of the women who die because of the indication that they're having a cesarean, not the operation itself. For example, they'll have amniotic fluid embolism. Mother codes, baby, its heart rate goes down. You do a crash cesarean, mother dies. That is chalked up to a cesarean death. If you eliminate those sorts of things, we estimated in this paper that probably 20 deaths annually in the entire United States are actually caused by the cesarean section. And there are multiple papers, not only from the US, but from places in Europe, showing that elective cesarean under spinal anesthesia has a lower risk of maternal death than unselected vaginal birth. So cesarean delivery is very, very safe. And These fundamental forces suggest that cesarean delivery is the answer to this problem, and it balances out at about 33%. That's where we're stuck, and I suspect that's where we're going to be forever until some of these things change. Pending new technologies to directly assess fetal brain oxygenation and real ways to predict which babies are not going to fit out, there's not going to be any significant change in the cesarean rate. Okay, because the fundamental forces we've outlined, the fundamental forces that drive that rate are simply not going to change. A focus to do something about the cesarean rate is really misguided. It's doomed to failure, and it may be making things worse. And let's look for a couple of examples. You're probably all aware of the consensus statement, the safe prevention of primary cesarean delivery. Surely a laudable goal. Now, when we're trying to determine when to do a cesarean for an active phase arrest, and that's fundamentally the question here, there are three things we've got to ask ourselves. When does active phase begin? How many hours stuck constitutes an arrest? And what constitutes adequate contractions? These are the three questions that we would answer in order to determine when to do a cesarean for labor arrest. Okay. Well, a number of papers have looked at these. If we look at the old Friedman data with an N, that's been tried and true for decades, an N of over 100 million, Friedman says the active phase begins at 4 centimeters, greater than 4 centimeters, that is. 2 hours of arrest is an arrest, and 5 contractions in 10 minutes is what we would call adequate. And this is the origin of the old labor curve that we don't really use that much anymore, but I think most of you are familiar with. On the other hand, Dwight Rouse did a similar sort of study. He defined the active phase as beginning at 3 centimeters, which most of us wouldn't consider to be the active phase, and determined that if you start the active phase at 3 centimeters, you can wait 4 hours safely. Not really surprising, right? Because if you're still in the latent phase, which most of these patients were, 4 hours is nothing. And defined adequate contractions as greater than 200 Montevideo units. And then the data that we're all familiar with, Zhang's data, with an N of 0, and I'll tell you why I say that in a minute, determined that the active phase began at 6 centimeters, but did not address these other two questions. Now let's talk about this Zhang data for a minute. If you look at that paper, and I'd urge you all to read it, it excluded women who underwent a cesarean, and it excluded women who had an adverse newborn outcome. Now, how in the world we can use data that excluded women with a cesarean and excluded all adverse outcomes to tell us when to perform a cesarean to avoid an adverse outcome is beyond my simple-minded comprehension, yet that's what we're doing. Remember that any data set is only valid in the context in which it was collected. That is the context described in the methods section of the paper. You can't take individual pieces of 3 vastly disparate studies, combine them, and then claim this is evidence-based. And yet that's exactly what we've done. If we look at these 3 questions again, what the safe prevention of the first cesarean delivery did is they took the definition of contraction frequency from Friedman's paper. They took the time that you can watch someone for a safely after an arrest from Rouse's data, and they took the definition of active phase of labor from Zhang's data. Threw these things all together, and because each of these individually was evidence-based, claimed that throwing these pieces together represented evidence-based medicine. It absolutely does not. And so the recommendations that you can have 4 hours of arrest with adequate contractions, or 6 hours if you can somehow look at 6 hours and find one segment of tracing that only has 4 contractions instead of 5. So now you can call it inadequate, that you can go 6 hours. These are the current recommendations, but it's not evidence-based. And even those recommendations only apply in the face of reassuring maternal fetal status, which is, as we've discussed, who knows what in the world that means. Thoughtless throwaway recommendations based only on a desperate desire to do something have the potential for great harm. And this is an example. A number of papers have looked at these recommendations and tried to analyze them. The first was a paper by Jamovsky with a massive N of 78, where they compared cesarean rates pre and post the implementation of those new labor guidelines. They found that the cesarean rate was decreased. In other words, if you don't do a cesarean, your cesarean rate will go down. Not really that surprising, but really had no difference in outcomes, but they conceded that with an N of 78, you could reach no conclusions with respect to outcomes. Wilson-Leedy was even more concerning. They did what some would consider to be an old trick. You do this thing called the composite outcome. And you see, they showed no difference in the composite outcome from the old labor recommendations and the new recommendations. But if you cleverly include the things we're actually interested in, such as low 5-minute APGAR score, metabolic acidemia, high base excess, throw in something like antibiotics that have nothing to do with anything here, the obvious non-difference in antibiotics is going to dwarf the differences that we see in any of these particular outcomes. And in fact, if you do as I have done, if you go back, look at this data, take the birth asphyxia parameters and analyze those separately, you find that with the new parameters, there is a significant increase in birth asphyxia, but it's buried in the use of composite outcome. Rosenblum, 2017, a large series, also found both adverse maternal and newborn outcomes with the new labor guidelines. And the only other paper really that systematically looked at this was a paper from France. They found no difference in outcomes, but with a cesarean rate of 6.9% and 17% operative vaginal delivery rate, clearly the practice has nothing to do with that in the United States. The fundamental thing is that if you look at this data critically, you'll find that there is very good data supporting the fact that you have more birth asphyxia, worse newborn outcomes using the new ACOG NIH guidelines. And I think we've discussed how that erroneous conclusion was reached. These guidelines have no meaningful supportive safety data, but do have significant data suggesting increase in adverse outcomes. And I can tell you that as somebody who has reviewed for the defense hundreds of cases involving bad outcomes, we are seeing birth injury, HIE claims now in cases at a clip that we haven't seen for the past decades, because women are just allowed to labor on and on and on. And I don't care what sort of convoluted data manipulation goes into it. A woman who is stuck at 8 centimeters for 6 hours is a jury is not going to buy that represents good care. Now, these rules don't take, the reason these rules are bad is because they are ineffective, is they don't take into account important things that clinicians should take into account. Parity, estimated fetal weight, pelvic size and shape, the size of the mother. Is the baby descending? What is the caput? Is this baby developing tremendous caput when it's stuck at 8 centimeters for 6 hours or not? As well as the mother's understanding of the safety data of a 2 versus a 4 versus a 6 hour period of labor arrest. And so when you ask me, what are we going to do about this, Dr. Clark? What are we going to do to decrease the cesarean rate? This is how I feel. I don't have a good answer. We cannot get off the train of fetal monitoring because of medical legal concerns, and we are stuck with non-evidence-based guidelines for doing a cesarean for labor arrest as well. It's a complete mess. It's a complete mess. And I think this slide probably sums it up. But it's worse. Let's look at another example. VBAC. VBAC standard of care has for decades been a swinging pendulum, back and forth and back and forth. And while we don't have time today to go into the details, there have been 5 different iterations of ACOG's recommendations for a safe trial of labor after cesarean. And I can just summarize these by saying in 1989, it was everything's great. Go ahead, very, very loose criteria. Once the bad outcomes started to be demonstrated, 1994, a new iteration of the ACOG VBAC guidelines, which were a little bit more conservative. The ultimate was in 1999, the most conservative VBAC guidelines, 99. And then because of public outcry regarding how conservative these were, the pendulum swung all the way back the other way. And in 2010, it was virtually do anything you darn well want to. Everything's okay with respect to VBAC. And then in the most recent iteration, once again, a little bit more conservative. Now, nobody can keep up with these ever-changing guidelines. And who knows, it's been 5 years. It's about time for another change, if you ask me. And so, unfortunately, what happens when we've got this sort of mess is that all too many obstetricians say, I can't keep up with this. I don't know what the standard of care is, what the standard of care isn't. Let's just do a repeat cesarean. Once again, as long as cesarean is the ready answer to the problem, cesareans will very often be chosen. This is the whole VBAC thing is a tug of war between vaginal birth at any cost advocates and patient safety, and ACOG's trying to satisfy both groups here. And I don't think that it's working. The cesarean rate, the VBAC rate has increased a little bit, but not as much, and certainly not as many VBACs as could safely be done are being done today. And it's a shame. I recall about 10 years ago when I was with HCA, we put together what would have been, I think, the largest VBAC data set in the world. And we set up some guidelines which were very, very strict in terms of what sort of facility was needed to do a vaginal birth after cesarean and how that vaginal birth after cesarean had to be approached. Very strict guidelines. And what we showed was that after the institution of those guidelines, the VBAC rate went up significantly. How can this be? It's because, you see, stories speak louder than statistics. And when a doctor comes into the doctor's lounge one morning and tells all of the colleagues about this horrible uterine rupture with an asphyxiated baby that she just had in the middle of the night, that negative outcome is going to weigh heavier in the minds of all of those practitioners than looking at some data that says no, VBAC is safe. And once you have a few of those bad outcomes, that is going to dramatically put a damper on people's enthusiasm for VBAC. On the other hand, if you don't have bad outcomes and there are no bad stories being banted about the hospital, then doctors are going to be much more willing to do VBACs. And again, as we demonstrated there, the VBAC rate actually went up. The paper was rejected, and it was rejected not on the basis of any data, but on the basis of the reviewer's concern that if the public were allowed access to these data, that women in rural areas might not choose to have as many VBACs anymore. And therefore, it was not appropriate to publish these data. No criticism of the data itself whatsoever. But it just, again, it shows you the problems that we have, and that if we followed science and got past our own biases, I truly believe the VBAC rate would be significantly higher than it is today. And that would be one thing that could bring down the overall cesarean rate. Well, how do we reconcile all of this? I've pointed out that most of the things we practice by, most of the tenets we believe in, are probably not true, yet there they are in black and white, and we kind of have to, we can't just go off half-cocked and not follow the published ACOG guidelines. How do we reconcile it? Well, here's my suggestion. When you get in a situation where the patient is 5 or 6 centimeters dilated, she's been 2 hours without change, the contractions are either 4 to 5 in 10 minutes palpating firm, or you have Montevideo units greater than 210. The question is, should we allow labor to continue? And I think under many circumstances, the answer is yes, we can do that. But the key to this is to understand that once we do that, we're on thin ice, okay? And that departing from letting a woman go ahead and be stuck for more than 2 hours without change, sort of like watching ugly decels just because the variability is good, may be scientifically appropriate, but it shouldn't be a matter of course. It shouldn't be done without thought. It should be the exception. We realize that when we depart from those traditional labor arrest criteria, we are on thin ice. We need then to ask ourselves these very same questions. What is her parity? What is the estimated weight? How big is the pelvis feel? How big is the mother? Has there been descent? Is there a lot of caput there? And then I think if we look at these sort of intangibles and come to the clinical conclusion that, yeah, I think we can let her go beyond the 2-hour stage for labor arrest. And we explain to the mother that, you know, we could do a cesarean after 2 hours, but some data suggests we could go to 4 as long as we watch it carefully. When all of these things are lined up, then I think it's quite appropriate to follow the current guidelines and allow labor arrest for more than 2 hours. But this ought to be done with great care. It shouldn't just be routine. The nurse calls us and says, Doctor, Mrs. Jones has been stuck for 3 hours at 7 centimeters. Okay, great. ACOG says she can go for 6. Call me back after 3 more hours. There's got to be a thoughtful evaluation, and that's all I'm saying here, before we just blithely say 6 hours is fine for everyone. And what drives me particularly crazy is this statement at the bottom. Have you ever heard that? I'll bet you have, because I hear it all the time. You're on turnover rounds, and somebody says, how's the lady in room 3 doing? Well, she's going to need to do a cesarean, but ACOG says we got wait another 2 hours before we do it. This is bad medicine, okay? When your judgment says this woman is not progressing, she's not going to do a cesarean, to say, I believe in my judgment, she needs one, but we've got to wait another 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it is something we should definitely avoid. Now, the new thing on the block here, and I hope that this becomes more popular. Emily Hamilton is spearheading this with the Perigen group, where they have data on tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of patients. And rather than use these arbitrary criteria, 4 centimeters as active phase, 6 centimeters as active phase, 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, et cetera, what Emily and her co-authors have suggested is that we have enough data now to put together 5th and 95th percentiles for that specific individual. Okay, that is her parity, her size, everything about her can go into the computer, and we can spit out a curve that looks very much like this, where we say for women exactly like this individual, these are the criteria. And we really don't care how many hours it takes. If she is within the 5th to 95th percentile limits of individuals who are just like she is, then we're fine to go. And when she falls off the curve, that's when you might do a cesarean. I think this, with this sort of mega data that Emily and others are putting together, this may ultimately be the answer to when to perform a cesarean rather than any of the arbitrary criteria we've mentioned before. So where does this leave us then in conclusion? We should be very cautious, not cavalier, as an active phase arrest or a second stage arrest goes beyond 2 hours, or with significant decelerations of any type. If we're going to allow labor to continue, we should make sure everything else is lined up, as I listed on those slides, and well documented. Don't guts out a worrisome fetal heart rate tracing. And above all, avoid the situation where using your best clinical judgment as the doctor or midwife on the scene, avoid the situation where you're saying, I know she's going to need a cesarean, but ACOG says we've got wait another X hours. And so you let her go, and all too often some catastrophe happens during that particular time. I always say every woman deserves an easy vaginal delivery or an easy cesarean delivery. And I think in terms of the overall cesarean rate, obstetricians are doing the very best we can do, given those driving forces which are not under our control. And I think that until those forces change, we're going to be pretty much right where we are. Now, I don't mean to be critical of attempts to reduce reduce unnecessary cesareans. I think that education can go a long ways to preventing unnecessary cesareans in individual pregnant patients, and that's a great thing. But I think you should not be discouraged in these efforts when you find that the actually decreasing the cesarean rate is not working, because that bigger picture is due to forces beyond our control. Thank you very much.
Dr. Clark, I don't know if anyone's going to chime in with a question right away, but I certainly will. First of all, I want to say thank you for joining us. And I know when we first reached out to you, you gave us the heavy kind of caveat that this may not be right up the alley of people who are ostensibly trying to reduce the cesarean rate as a statewide QI initiative. And I first of all just want to say this was exactly what we hoped for. And I think you are speaking our language to a really great degree, because we're at this inflection point as an organization where we're looking at really what we're calling provider level forces and these systems level forces. And a lot of what you're talking about, market forces, are the same things we're identifying and trying to generate conversations with hospitals about, to the degree that all of these market forces are set, what are the things that hospital leadership can really acknowledge and own and maybe engage with. And shift some of that burden off of kind of hitting people over the head with guidelines or tolerance for category 2 tracings, or the things that you caution about. I do have a question, which is, I think that, so I don't come away from this as despondent by any means. I do think that as we talk about it, though, a lot of these market forces maybe to me aren't as immutable as they might look. And so I think about sort of tort reform as one of these things that comes up. And when you look at data that shows, state by state, the different medical legal environments are actually associated with different C-section rates, I think that's one kind of interesting area. But one area I want to explicitly ask about that wasn't on your market forces is reimbursement rates. So there's really fun data that shows that The wider the differential between a reimbursement for a C-section versus a vaginal delivery, the higher the C-section rate. There's also data that shows that as those narrow, the C-section rate goes down. And there's some conversations and some interesting papers about blended payment models to try to address that. Speaking from experience as someone who watched in the hospital I was at before coming to Denver Health, just how people tried to juggle being on the labor floor versus being in their office, and the time commitment of a vaginal birth versus the ease of getting a C-section done and going out. I think this is a really real phenomenon. So as far as advocacy goes, I wonder what your thoughts are on that reimbursement rate issue.
Well, I'm aware of that data. One of the problems I have with that is I've known a lot of obstetricians in my life. And I've known great ones, and I've known some horrible ones that have no business practicing. But I've never encountered anybody who did a C-section for the money. It's just our lives are too busy, labor, until I've never encountered anybody who made that decision because they got paid more money. I just haven't. I've seen a lot of other bad stuff happen. I think that ideally, I'm with you though, ideally you'd pay more for a vaginal birth. I think that would be fair, because it takes a lot more time to sit there on labor and delivery all night long watching those ugly decelerations than it does just to do a cesarean. But that produces, and I've actually suggested that to a couple of healthcare systems, that produces really a medical legal nightmare, because you can imagine then, doctor, you didn't do a cesarean because you could get more money if you just let her push with this awful tracing for longer. So that's sort of that's one of the glitches that we have there. I think the answer in my mind, and there's not great data to support this, just my opinion. One of the problems is that, with the exception of midwives, I think, for most obstetricians, doing a delivery is something that takes you away from something else you really need to be doing at that time. It pulls you away from your office. It pulls you out of your bed. It pulls you away from having a little bit of free time. The hospitalist model would solve that, where you're right there and you don't care whether you do a cesarean or whether you don't do a cesarean. It's completely immaterial. You're there for a certain amount of time, and there you are. And I really like the Swedish and much of the European model, where everybody who comes in is just a patient of the hospital for delivery, and they're all taken care of by midwives. And there's an obstetrician sitting there in the hospital in case something happens. But the midwives are on a shift basis. They don't care whether it's a long labor or a short labor. They just want to have a safe labor. So I think that the hospitalist model may be the more, and advocating that may be the most realistic way to sort of indirectly address the reimbursement problem, which is a real issue that you're describing.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
The floor is open for anyone else who has questions. If you don't want to come off mic, we're happy to use the chat. We'll give you an awkward minute of silence until you pipe in. Please, Stefka, go.
Great, thank you. Dr. Clark, thank you very much. That was very insightful. And I have to say, I've been kind of following, I don't know if it's a career development, but your course from trying to establish algorithm to deal with fetal heart tracing and interpretation to the latest publications saying how, really imperfect this technology is and not designed for the answers that we're seeking. In your presentation, you mentioned the Hamilton data and
Yes.
using the 95% kind of what is normal. Do you know in how many places, how many institutions have used this Is it
Very few.
Is there any outcomes data to follow the adoption of this labor curve?
I don't think there is as of yet. This is all pretty new, and Perry Jin that makes the program that plots all this stuff is expanding and busily collecting sort of big data that I think will ultimately allow that sort of thing to be studied. But I just point out this is something on the potential horizon. It's certainly not here as a proven method. Yet. In respect to that category 2, that's something I guess I can mention. Most of you are probably aware of that of the paper we put together 10 years, 50 some years ago on management of a category 2 heart rate tracing. What I did at that point is I called I got all the people who had ever done anything on fetal monitoring. I called them up, and at that time I was in Salt Lake City, and said, look, we got to do something about this mess. I want you to get on a plane. I want you to come out here. We'll meet 1 month from now. We'll sit down and let's hammer out an algorithm that we can all agree is not the only way to manage a category 2, but all of the people on that who authored, if you've seen that paper, all of those people agree this would be in compliance with the standard of care. If you do it this way, you are in compliance. There may be other ways to do it too. And I put together a sort of a draft so we'd have something to work from, and everybody flew in and we all got together in a room, and I thought this was going to take 2 days to hash out. And it took about an hour and a half. What I found is that everybody pretty much agreed on the same way to manage a category 2 tracing. And so we were able very quickly to hammer out that particular algorithm. We found that that's to be, now, I don't claim that that gives you any better results. I don't claim that that gives you any fewer cesareans or any more cesareans. What that does, though, is I think it does offer some significant protection because it's so darn specific. If you follow that algorithm when you see a category 2 tracing, then essentially you have all of those people who authored that saying you did right, versus some renegade expert without any expertise who claims he sees some fanciful things that nobody else can see. That doesn't go over well with juries. And what I found is that has been a tremendous help in my experience. When someone can show, look, we followed this algorithm to a T, it's pretty hard to come in and say, yeah, but that's substandard care when you look at that author list. So I'd refer you to that since you mentioned that category 2 paper, but I can't claim it gives you any better or worse outcomes, or it gives you any more or fewer cesareans. It's just one way to be in compliance with the standard of care.
Yes, thank you.
We just have another minute or two here left. We do have a question in the chat. Dr. Clark, one of the things you said is that you feel like every birthing person deserves either an easy vaginal birth or an easy cesarean. And the question here comes with some of the down the line issues of having an easy cesarean. The question is, when a woman dies of a placental abnormality, an accreta, for example, is that attributed to the previous cesarean? And is there any data to back this?
Well, sure. In most cases, most accretas are in fact related to a previous cesarean. And in fact, that is something that needs to be taken into account when you're thinking about doing a cesarean. But the number of deaths from accreta in a big center is so small as to be almost negligible. At the Texas Children's, I think we do more accretas than anybody in the world. We advertise, we say, send us all your tough cases. We do 3 or 4 accreta cases a week, and we've got a whole specialized team that deals with that. And the only woman who has ever died with an accreta, the operation went fine, and on day 2, she ruptured a splenic artery aneurysm right out of the blue and bled to death. Had nothing to do with it. Otherwise, deaths from accreta almost always occur when the patient delivers in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people. And if that person is referred to a big center that does it right, the risk of death is almost, not exactly, but almost negligible. And so there are things we can do to address that. But so it is something that we need to think about. But to say, if we look at the downsides of labor that went on too long or a heart rate tracing that looked too awful, and we compare those downsides against the actual risks of accreta in a proper center, in my view, the scales come out way in favor of every woman deserves an easy vaginal delivery or an easy cesarean section. Those other concerns are dramatic, but I think they are pretty much overblown, and particularly in today when very few women have more than a couple of babies. I do think that if this were a woman who's quite specifically, perhaps because of religious or cultural reasons, said, no, I'm going to have 8 kids. I think that when you came up on this, recognized you're on thin ice, that would be something to discuss with the patient. Is we will do a cesarean, and your repeat cesarean rate will be higher. That would be something to consider. But since the rate of accretas, particularly the percretas, which are really the only problems when it invades other organs, otherwise it's a simple TAH. That rate really climbs significantly after 2 cesareans. In reality, I don't think it's as big a problem as it is for most women, but I concede it is something to think about.
Thank you so much for your responses. Guys, round of applause for Dr. Clark for joining us today. We have one very brief announcement for the cohort. Those of you who will participate in our cesarean reduction in patient safety bundle, our data analyst has a really quick announcement for you.
Thanks, everybody. I'll sign off.
Thanks, Dr. Clark. Cindy, I don't even know if Gretchen is here. Is Gretchen here? No, Gretchen moved on. Okay, the announcement is that your data dashboards are going to the website. So you will have a website access to your data dashboard now. The champions have received an email from WordPress. So please check your inboxes, email from WordPress. And this is what's going to give you access to sign into your data dashboard from the CPCQC website. So please reach out if you guys have questions about it. We don't want you to miss that email because I think access through the website is going to be more convenient for you all. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate your attendance. We're going to sign off. Thanks.